The briefing room at Fort Bragg smelled faintly of stale coffee and dry marker ink. A projector hummed at the front, throwing a grainy map of Louisiana's forest terrain onto the wall. The room was filled with the muted rustle of uniforms, notebooks, and the low murmur of officers exchanging comments. Outside, the faint thump of a helicopter faded into the Carolina sky. It was just another debrief at the Special Operations Command Center. But beneath the routine, there was tension. Captain Derek Hollis, commander of a Navy SEAL detachment, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His voice carried the kind of confidence that filled a room even when it didn't need to. He was reviewing the after-action report from a recent joint exercise, scrolling through data and casualty simulations on the screen. A half-smile crossed his face as he spoke, saying the sniper who had taken out his men during the training must have just gotten lucky. Probably couldn't even see past 200 meters in that terrain. A few of the SEAL officers chuckled quietly. At the far end of the table, Staff Sergeant Emily Rhodes sat still, her hands folded on a notebook. She didn't react. She didn't need to. Her name was on that report. Though Hollis clearly hadn't made the connection yet. Around here, a few Army instructors shifted slightly in their seats, their silence protective but respectful. They all knew her reputation. She was one of the most disciplined sniper instructors at Fort Moore, a soldier known for showing up early, staying late, and never speaking more than necessary. Her uniform was sharp, the subdued sniper tab above her pocket, a quiet declaration of mastery. The room's fluorescent lights caught the faint sheen of her combat action badge. She kept her eyes forward as Hollis continued to talk. Dismissing the report's outcome as a fluke, the projector flickered. The briefing officer cleared his throat and moved the discussion forward. But the atmosphere didn't relax. Emily sat unmoving, calm as stone. A quiet reminder that the forest had its own kind of truth. When the meeting ended, she gathered her notes, stood, and left the room without a sound. Outside, the wind carried the distant echo of another helicopter. Lifting off, the narrator's voice lingered like the hum of its rotors. Some people prove their strength by speaking louder. Others, like her, let silence do the talking. Emily Rhodes grew up in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, in a place where the hills seemed to whisper and the trees held old memories. Her grandfather, a Vietnam veteran and former Army Ranger, was the center of her world. He lived in a small cabin built from rough-cut pine, the walls lined with hunting rifles, maps, and faded photographs from another lifetime. From the time she could walk, he took her into the woods, teaching her how to move quietly through wet leaves, how to tell which way the wind turned by watching the tops of trees, and how to wait without moving for as long as it took. He used to say that patience was a weapon all its own. She learned to follow deer tracks through the mud, to listen for the snap of a twig that didn't belong, and to tell the difference between the sound of a rabbit's breath and the shifting of wind through branches. The forest became her classroom. It taught her to think in silence, to be still until the world forgot she was there. Her father worked the coal mines that ran under those same hills. One morning, when she was 12, the mine collapsed. The news came in a single phone call that changed everything. Her mother, a nurse at the small hospital in Hazard, began working double shifts to keep food on the table. Emily never complained. She hunted with her grandfather to help fill the freezer and learned that strength wasn't loud. It was steady. When she turned 19, 2 weeks after high school graduation, she enlisted in the Army. Basic training at Fort Jackson was a shock, but she adapted quickly. The discipline feeling familiar after years of her grandfather's quiet rules, she moved to Fort Benning for infantry training, then earned her airborne wings before joining the 82nd Airborne Division. In Kandahar, Afghanistan, she proved herself under fire, staying calm during a nighttime ambush and helping her squad survive until reinforcements arrived. That action earned her the Combat Action Badge, but she didn't talk about it. Later, she applied to the U.S. Army Sniper Course at Fort Benning, finishing third in her class and becoming one of the first women in her brigade to earn that qualification. Her classmates remembered her as the one who never rushed a shot, never lost focus, and never spoke unless she had something worth saying. Years later, when people called her one of the best, she would think back to those early mornings in the Kentucky woods. Her grandfather's voice would echo in her mind, reminding her that patience and silence had always been her greatest weapons. The conference room at Fort Polk smelled of dry erase markers and burnt coffee. Maps covered the walls, their edges curling from use, and a projector hummed as it cast the digital terrain model of the Kisatchie National Forest across the front screen. Around the table sat officers from both the Army and the Navy, their nameplates lined in neat order. It was a joint briefing for the upcoming training rotation at the Joint Readiness Training Center. The operation, code-named Falcon Trail, would simulate an escape and evasion scenario through 40 square miles of dense forest. The Navy SEAL detachment would move as a small team, evading capture, while an Army opposition force tracked them. The sniper course had been asked to provide that opposing element, and Staff Sergeant Emily Rhodes had been selected to lead it. Herr Commander, a lieutenant colonel with years of experience in fieldcraft instruction, made the announcement without ceremony. She sat 2 seats down from him, notebook open, pen steady in her hand. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Captain Derek Hollis leaned back, arms crossed, and spoke with a tone that cut through the stillness. He said his team trained against Tier 1 adversaries and didn't see the point of running an exercise against a single Army sniper. He wanted a challenge, not what he called a distraction. The words hung in the air like smoke. A few officers shifted in their seats. Emily stayed still, her expression unreadable. Her commander spoke calmly, explaining that she had logged more field hours in woodland tracking and stalking than anyone in the room. Her evaluation scores placed her in the top 5% of instructors in the Army. Hollis glanced at her, unimpressed, and replied that classroom ratings didn't always hold up under pressure. The projector flickered, as if reacting to the tension. No one raised their voice. Military professionalism held everything in check. But the friction was clear. When the meeting adjourned, chairs scraped the floor and papers shuffled. Emily closed her notebook, stood, and nodded to her commander before leaving the room. Outside, the Louisiana air felt heavy, thick with humidity. She looked toward the tree line beyond the training field, the pines rising like sentinels. The forest didn't care about ranks or reputations. It only respected skill, patience, and silence. In a few days, it would reveal who understood that truth better. The night before the exercise was quiet at Fort Moore. The air smelled of pine and gun oil, and somewhere far across the range came the low rumble of artillery practice. Muffled by distance, Staff Sergeant Emily Rhodes sat alone on the concrete steps outside her barracks, the cool Georgia air brushing across her face. The parade field ahead of her was empty, lit only by the faint yellow glow of a streetlight. It was late, past 10, but she wasn't thinking about sleep. Her gear lay spread out in precise order beside her, each item cleaned, checked, and ready. The M110 semi-automatic sniper system rested across her lap, its metal cool against her palm. She ran a cloth over the receiver, checking every screw, every mount, and the smooth click of the charging handle. The faint smell of CLP oil lingered in the air. Her AN divided by PVS 27 night optic and thermal scope sat beside her, lenses cleaned and capped. The glass catching a thin glint of light, she tested the focus ring, slow and steady, then set it back down. Her ghillie suit was neatly folded, strips of burlap, already darkened with local soil, to match the forest terrain of Louisiana. A small container of camouflage paint sat next to it. She lined up her Miles gear sensors, rucksack, MRE push, hydration tablets, and water bladder in perfect sequence. Checking straps and seals. Every movement had purpose. Every sound was controlled. It was the ritual of readiness, something every sniper understood. The stillness of the night gave her space to think. Her mind went back to the hills of Kentucky, to her grandfather's voice, telling her that most people failed not because they were weak, but because they gave up when things got hard. Patience, he'd said, would outlast fear every time. She believed him then, and she believed him now. The field test tomorrow wasn't about speed or power. It was about endurance, the kind that lived in silence. She closed her eyes for a moment, her hand resting on the rifle beside her. The forest would soon test her again. She took a deep breath, slow and even, and the world fell into stillness. In that quiet, she found calm. At 4 a.m, the sound of rotor blades broke through the quiet of the Kisatchie National Forest. The MH-60 Blackhawk hovered above the treetops, its downwash bending the grass and sending pine needles swirling through the air. Below, the Navy SEAL team touched down fast and low, moving with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, the helicopter lifted away, its sound fading into the dark. The men adjusted their rucks, secured weapons, and began their movement north, disappearing into the forest. Their formation was tight but disciplined. Stegel for dispersion. Each operator scanning a sector, they moved along a narrow creek bed to mask their noise. Using terrain and darkness as their first layers of concealment, the only sound was the muted crunch of boots and the faint creak of webbing under weight. 800 meters away, Staff Sergeant Emily Rhodes lay prone on a ridgeline, already in place 24 hours earlier. Her ghillie suit blended into the damp leaves, its fibers darkened with mud and pine. Through her thermal optic, the forest glowed in shades of ghostly white. She could see the seals moving below, heat signatures shifting through the trees, each one crisp against the cooler backdrop of the ground. Her M110 rifle rested on its bipod, scope steady, chambered with 7 60mm training rounds. She didn't move, not even to brush away the insects crawling across her gloves. Her breathing was slow, and even through her spotting monocular, she marked their movement, counting seconds between halts, noting the team's rhythm. Every small pattern revealed something: the point man's tendency to angle left, the rear security's delayed reaction, the team leader's hand signals. She studied the terrain and built the next 2 kilometers in her mind. There was a natural bottleneck ahead where 2 ridges funneled into a narrow draw. It was perfect ground for an ambush. So she moved there, under the cover of darkness. Her steps were measured, her rucksack shifting in silence. She used the terrain like a current, sliding through low ground, always staying below the skyline. By the time the first light began to bleed into the horizon, her observation post was set. When the SEALs arrived 6 hours later, she was already watching. Through her scope, their figures appeared like ghosts moving through a thin veil of mist. The line advanced in a staggered column, spacing tight but disciplined. The forest around them was alive with faint sound gear brushing against bark, the soft crunch of boots in wet soil, radios whispering low. She locked onto the last man in the formation, his movement methodical but predictable, distance 450 meters, wind negligible. She adjusted elevation, slow and smooth, exhaled, and pressed the trigger. The laser sensor on her rifle registered the hit. On the other side, the man froze, looking down as his Miles gear beeped to signal a simulated kill. The radio on his team leader's shoulder crackled as he called in the casualty. The SEALs dropped instantly into cover, scanning arcs, sweeping thermals, searching for a flash or reflection. They found nothing. Emily was already moving, sliding down a drainage ditch 200 meters south, her body close to the ground, her rifle cradled tight. She vanished into the woods before the seals had even shifted position. In the stillness that followed, the forest reclaimed its quiet. The hum of insects rose again, and the trees swayed gently in the breeze. From somewhere far off, the faint echo of her movement dissolved into the distance. For Emily, the exercise had truly begun. The forest was her ally, her cover, her weapon. Strength and speed meant little here. Only patience, silence, and discipline would decide who lasted longest. The nights in the Kisatchie National Forest were long and heavy with humidity. The air clung to everything, and the woods never went fully silent. Crickets filled the darkness, the sound of their rhythm broken only by the distant call of an owl. Staff Sergeant Emily Rhodes moved through it like a shadow. Her steps were measured, her breathing shallow, every movement absorbed by the forest. She followed the SEAL team from a distance, keeping their faint heat signatures in her thermal scope, their silhouettes flickering like ghosts across her lens. Through her AN divided by PVS 27 night vision, she studied them from a ridge one night, noting how they rotated watch shifts, how often they checked their comms, how their formation tightened after every loss. She kept a log of their changes, small notations scribbled on a waterproof pad tucked into her sleeve. On the second night, she waited until they stopped near a clearing to establish a comms link. The communications specialist knelt to set up a satellite antenna, the soft glow of his tablet screen reflecting off his gear. Emily had already calculated the range. 400 meters. Crosswind barely noticeable. She pressed the trigger, the miles laser marking the hit. The man froze, tapping his harness as the system beeped. Before the rest reacted, she was already sliding backward down a ditch, vanishing into the undergrowth. The next day, she watched from a hidden position near a shallow river. The SEAL team moved carefully, spacing tighter, scanning sectors. As the point man crossed first, she marked him, simulated the shot, then disappeared again. Hours later, she hit the medic as he leaned over a downed teammate during a simulated casualty drill. 3 engagements, 3 hits, 3 disappearances. Every time they adjusted, she adjusted faster. By the 4th day, her rations were nearly gone. She ate cold bites from an MRE pouch, washed them down with creek water. She had filtered through a small purification system. Her ghillie suit was caked in mud, crawling with fire ants and chiggers. But she ignored the discomfort. Movement invited mistakes. Stillness was survival. The SEALs grew frustrated, changing tactics. They swept with thermals, set deception traps, even doubled back on their own trail. She saw every change before it happened. The forest told her what they couldn't hide: the faint ripple of disturbed leaves, the way birds went quiet in their path. At dusk on the 4th night, she crouched beneath a fallen log, eyes scanning through her scope. Sweat rolled into her collar, and the rifle felt like an extension of her breathing. The woods around her pulsed with life, 1,000 sounds blending into something steady and familiar. It no longer felt like she was in the forest. It felt like she was part of it. The trees shielded her. The shadows moved with her. She had become what her grandfather always told her to be: patient, unseen, unshakable. The forest was her ally now. It hid her, protected her, and spoke her language. The air in the Kisatchie National Forest was thick enough to taste. Heat clung to everything, turning breath into mist and movement into effort. Around a narrow creek line deep in the woods, the last 3 members of the SEAL team crouched in silence. Their uniforms were streaked with dirt, their faces marked with frustration. They had spent 11 days trying to find one sniper who had outmaneuvered them again and again. Now they waited in ambush, convinced she would make her next move soon. The forest hummed with life, but felt heavy with tension. Insects buzzed in the humidity. Frogs croaked from the water's edge. And somewhere above, a branch cracked as if warning them that they were being watched. Staff Sergeant Emily Rhodes had been tracking them since sunrise. She had followed the faint trail of boot prints, half buried in pine needles, a cigarette butt pressed into the soil, and the irregular flicker of heat signatures through her thermal scope. She found their position by reading what most would miss: the unnatural stillness of birds above them, the faint ripple of disturbed ferns downwind, settling into a shallow depression behind a fallen oak, 150 meters away. She adjusted her M110 rifle, checked wind drift, and confirmed range. Then she waited. The hours passed slowly. The temperature climbed above 90 degrees, the air unmoving and stifling. Sweat soaked her shirt and pooled behind her knees. Fire ants crawled up her sleeve, and a mosquito buzzed near her ear. But she didn't flinch. Her breathing stayed steady, shallow enough to avoid moving the rifle's crosshairs. Through her thermal optic, the three seals were motionless shapes, faint but clear. She waited until the sun dipped lower, shadows stretching long through the trees. Then, at last, one of them shifted to adjust his pack. That half-second of motion was all she needed. She exhaled and pressed the trigger. The miles system on his vest registered a hit. The other two reacted instantly. One moved right, the other cut left. Sweeping their sights across her last known position, they moved with precision, flanking like they had trained 100 times before. But Emily was already gone. She had slid backward into a shallow ravine moments after firing, her rifle tight against her chest. Moving low, she circled wide through the underbrush. Using terrain and fading light to mask her approach, she climbed to a new firing point 200 meters away, set her rifle, and watched through her scope as the two operators crossed into her previous position. She squeezed twice, slow and deliberate. Two more beeps echoed faintly from their Miles harnesses. For a few seconds, there was nothing but stillness. Then the radio crackled with the voice of exercise control calling over the net, "Index. Index. All players proceed to extraction." The forest released its breath. Emily stayed prone for another minute, letting the adrenaline drain away. Then she stood, slinging her rifle and adjusting the strap on her ruck. Her uniform was streaked with mud, her face smeared with camouflage paint. She stepped through the tree line and into the fading orange light. Ahead, the distant sound of helicopter rotors carried across the forest. She moved toward it slowly, calm and steady, her silhouette small against the trees. Behind her, the forest was quiet again, as if it had swallowed every sound she made. The extraction zone was a clearing carved out of the forest, the ground packed with dust and littered with boot prints. The late afternoon sun burned low through the trees, turning the air into a haze of golden heat. The deep thump of helicopter rotors filled the background, steady and rhythmic, while the smell of jet fuel mixed with the earthy scent of pine. Staff Sergeant Emily Rhodes walked out of the tree line, her rifle slung over her shoulder, her uniform streaked with dirt and sweat. Her ghillie suit hung loose from her pack, and every step she took left a faint trail of dust. She looked tired but composed, her pace steady, her face unreadable. The SEAL team was already there, sitting in a loose circle near the MH-60 Their faces were drawn, their eyes shaded under the brims of their helmets. They had the look of men who had been pushed to their limits, caught between fatigue and disbelief. None of them spoke. When Captain Derek Hollis saw her approaching, he stood. For a moment, he didn't move. The wind from the rotors blew against his uniform, the sound so loud it made everything else fade away. He walked forward slowly, stopping a few feet from her. His expression, once filled with confidence and skepticism, had changed. There was something different in his eyes now, something quiet, respectful. He extended his hand. The gesture said what words didn't need to. She reached out, shook it firmly, and nodded once. Hollis told her she had given his team the hardest 11 days of their careers. She met his gaze, but didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence said enough. Around them, the helicopters idled, the noise filling the gap between their words. She turned toward her pack and shouldered it again, ready to move. Respect doesn't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes it comes in silence, earned in sweat and patience, proven where words fall short. For Emily Rhodes, this moment was more than vindication. It was acknowledgement. She had never needed an apology. The respect was enough. 2 weeks after the exercise, Staff Sergeant Emily Rhodes sat outside the commanding general's office at the Maneuver Center of Excellence in Fort Moore. The hallway smelled faintly of floor wax and coffee, the sound of boots clicking across tile echoing from somewhere down the corridor. When her name was called, she stepped inside and saluted. The general behind the desk returned the gesture, his tone formal but warm. Papers were stacked neatly beside him, and a single folder sat open on top her after-action review. He told her he had read every line of it. The report described her performance as exceptional, highlighting her stalking discipline, fieldcraft precision, and calm under continuous operational pressure. Then he explained that the Naval Special Warfare Command had officially requested her as a guest instructor for their advanced sniper course at the Naval Special Warfare Center in Coronado, California. It was rare for a soldier outside the Navy to be asked, rarer still for it to be a woman. She listened in silence, her face steady, her hands still at her sides. When he congratulated her, she simply nodded and thanked him. She wasn't the type to smile for recognition. The work had always been its own reward. Coronado felt like a different world. The Pacific stretched wide beyond the rifle range, the crash of surf mixing with the rhythmic sound of gunfire. The students she trained came from every branch: SEAL snipers, Marine Scout snipers, Air Force Special Tactics operators. They came expecting to be taught by someone older, someone louder. Instead, they found Emily Rhodes. She spoke little, demonstrated more, and earned their respect the same way she always had, through patience, precision, and quiet mastery. Captain Derek Hollis later wrote her recommendation for the Army Commendation Medal, praising her professionalism and her contribution to joint training. Her name began to circulate quietly among the community, passed between instructors and soldiers, told not as a legend but as a lesson. Years later, her story still lived on, not in headlines or speeches, but in the quiet respect of those who knew what discipline truly meant. The morning was bright and still at Fort Moore. The parade field stretched wide beneath a clear sky, the air filled with the scent of cut grass and polish. Rows of soldiers stood in formation, their uniforms pressed, their boots aligned in perfect rows. The American flag rippled above them, the fabric snapping in the light breeze. The rhythmic steps of the honor guard echoed across the field, followed by the soft rustle of dress coats as each soldier came to attention. At the center of it all stood Sergeant Major Emily Rhodes, her medals catching the sun in small flashes of gold and silver. Her posture was steady, her expression calm, the weight of decades of service resting quietly on her shoulders. Her grandfather sat in the front row of the audience, a cane across his lap, his hat held respectfully in both hands. He was 84 now, his frame thin but his eyes still sharp, still filled with that quiet, unshakable pride she had known since childhood. When the final salute was given and the band began its slow march, the crowd rose in applause. Emily stepped down from the platform as the music swelled, the Army song carrying across the field. Her grandfather stood with effort and walked toward her, each step careful but deliberate. When he reached her, he looked up with a small smile and spoke softly, his voice steady despite his age. He told her she had done exactly what he once taught her. She had waited, she had watched, and she had never given up. She didn't answer right away. She just nodded, her throat tight, her eyes glistening in the sunlight. The band struck the final note, and she turned toward the formation, standing a little taller, her hand coming up in one last salute. Around here, the air felt lighter. The sound of flags snapping sharp and clear. She had spent a lifetime mastering patience, precision, and silence. And now, in this quiet moment, she understood that her greatest legacy wasn't in medals or stories told. It was in the soldiers she had trained, the discipline she had lived by, and the calm strength she had carried through every battle, both in the field and within herself. True strength, she thought, was never loud. It was steady, it was earned, and it endured